Hello. Justice often seems to be a rough instrument of public policy. Police make mistakes. Judges make mistakes too. We're all human after all. But sometimes mistakes are not all they seem to be.
Judge Sir Frederick Armstrong was distracted as he sat at the Westbridge District Court hearing a case about robbery and assault. He had a problem. It was gnawing at him night and day, and now he was struggling to concentrate on the matter at hand. The legal arguments and the witness evidence washed over him so that he had difficulty in picking up the thread when some challenge or appeal to him was made from either barrister arguing contrary cases. He looked at the man in the dock. Yes, he was guilty. Evidence be damned, he knew it from his eyes. He looked at the jury. The 12 men and women looked intent. The defence barrister was young, still passionate, but it was wasted. The jury plainly disbelieved him. The man was going down, no question. The judge drifted again to the intractable problem he was turning over in his mind. It was as hopeless as the chances of the defendant in the dock getting off with a suspended sentence. Sir Frederick Armstrong, Freddie to his friends, was a meticulous man in everything he did, and known for his harsh sentences upon any miscreant unfortunate enough to come before him. He had 2 vices which preoccupied his leisure time. One was tinkering with old clocks and timepieces. The delicate mechanisms of escapements and the intricate cooperation of cogs and wheels in perfect equilibrium fascinated him. The other vice, well, we'll come to that. The world was a logical place, and every action had its equal and opposite reaction. It was a principle he observed with rigour in his judgments in the High Court, and he was known for his incisive sentences delivered without fear or any favour whatsoever. He was a hard man, and inevitably, along his righteous path of dispensing justice to its hilt, he had received occasional threats to himself and to his wife, Miranda, also. But he didn't allow these to deter him from his unswervingly righteous cause. He had become accustomed to them, and he knew, within an acceptable margin of error, that such threats would rarely, if ever, be acted upon. The alarm system of his townhouse in Cadogan Square was wired to the local police station, and similar measures were in place at the Deep-Cut House down in Surrey. It is said that all men, though, however proper and temperate they appear to be in their public lives, have a dark secret within, one which they will guard at all costs. Politicians, priests, and royalty have time and again discovered the truth of this, and suffered the consequences of disgrace, or worse, for some dark indulgence. Judge Armstrong was no exception to this. We never really know what goes on in the minds of others whose workings are not susceptible to the meticulous machinery of a well-crafted and adjusted timepiece. The random impulses which ricochet across the universe of the brain are unpredictable, and small pools of darkness gather and occupy the hidden recesses of the human mind, leaching out in unguarded moments. Freddie had a mistress, a lady barrister called Helen Catterick, intelligent, quick-minded, and with an insatiable lust. He spent snatched nights with her, occasional weekends at the judge's lodgings when he was out on circuit. He had only recently become a High Court judge, and was happy to spend time in the district courts whenever the opportunity presented itself, precisely because of this fringe benefit it offered. It was a satisfying alternate reality for him. He had the best of both worlds, his domestic life, which was proper and orderly, occasionally opulent, thanks to his extremely wealthy wife Miranda, and the reckless, injudicious, and carnal one he enjoyed with Helen. This had been going on for 2 years now. At first Helen and he were thrilled to be together. It was a kind of madness which had begun when she had been appearing before him at the Central Criminal Court, and he had invited her to his rooms for a drink. They had discussed the case in hand, but it was apparent to both that neither of them had any interest in this. It was conversation with another purpose. Their eyes met in a kind of gloating mutual admiration. It had felt hot and dangerous there. She lingered when they ran out of words, and looked away absently, gazing out upon the city. He had joined her contemplation of this beyond the Georgian sash window. A burning truth between them was acknowledged. They both knew it. At last he had asked her to join him for dinner. She had said yes, innocently, though his invitation wasn't innocent, and her acceptance of it amounted to complicity. She was an accessory before, during, and after the fact. Delightfully so. The illicit thrill they shared that fumbling evening was with him still. Its suddenness, it carried them forward into the weeks ahead. They wanted for nothing more. They enjoyed whatever time they could find to spend together, and his regular trips on the southern circuit became an illicit thrill. But of late something had changed. She had become restive. He knew what it was, too. She wanted to be Lady Armstrong. Sir Frederick Armstrong had discovered that which all mere mortals eventually discover, even High Court judges. He could not have his cake and eat it. He knew now that she would tire of the office of mistress long before he would. His promises and hints that he would assist her career simply to stay the moment of execution would work for a time, but he was an intelligent man. They did not remove it. One day the trapdoor would swing open, and he knew this. It was a fault in the fine balance of his machine which he could not correct. Of course, Helen Catterick was only one part of the equation. The other was the present Lady Armstrong, Miranda. She was a severe lady, whom he had long tired of. His domestic life was, to others, without complaint. He had married her principally for her money, obviously. She had been a tall, handsome woman then, of querulous disposition, bony and angular in person and character. He had been caught in the self-deception that commonly afflicts young lovers, the belief that transitory physical passions will last. When he was a 29-year-old aspiring barrister, and she a 39-year-old daughter of one of the wealthiest men in Britain, the difference in their age had been easily outweighed by the benefit her wealth had yielded. But that was no longer so. He was now 54, and she was 64. The scales had altered. His ambitions for life, for love, were not yet satiated. He enjoyed dinners, speaking at professional legal events, where his quick and logical mind and acid wit were readily appreciated. And he hoped for high office still. His wife was a woman of low intellect. Mundanity characterized all her thoughts and conversation. But the Cadogan Square house they lived in was hers. She paid the bills. Their country house at Deepcut was hers too. The furniture came from her ancient esteemed family. He was a junior partner in the firm, and only felt comfortable when he was his own master, bewigged and gowned, splendid with cruel authority, and returning to Helen in his lodgings, a happy thief. He would love for her to be Lady Armstrong. "My lord, I must protest," broke in Mr. Bryant, counsel for the defence. "The evidence concerning the finding of the stolen items is not disputed by my client. My learned friend repeats the same line of questioning as though he has uncovered some dark misdoings. It is quite improper of him to do so." Sir Freddy woke from his reverie and peered over his glasses cautiously. He had no idea what they were speaking of, still less who was in the right. He sighed wearily, as if moderately exasperated himself by the proceedings. He hedged. "Mr. Lettermore, it seems to me that you have indeed transgressed in the regard suggested by counsel for the defence, and I must say you are testing my patience also with this line of questioning. Please restrict yourself in future to questions pertinent to the matter in hand. I hope I make myself clear." "Very clear, my lord. I withdraw my previous question," said the chastened Mr. Lettermore, K.C., bowing his head in apology. "Very good. Please continue, Mr. Lettermore." His lordship attended briefly to the continued questioning, glanced at the jury, who were none the wiser, and drifted again to the conundrum of his personal life. On his country walks with his dog, Lifer, Sir Frederick grappled with the problem, turning over each possibility in his mind. Divorce was one solution he had contemplated, but each time he considered this, he found himself obliged to rule it out of the question. His estate was his wife's, his property and wealth, his comforts, his life, all were in his wife's account. The loss of her would sever more than their partnership. It would alter his life beyond that which he considered tolerable. And as he weighed the scales of this, blind in impartiality, he found each time that the life he had on the one hand could not be outweighed by Helen's attractions on the other. There was an equilibrium that must be broken. A great concern was the stunting of his ambitions, which a radical breach in relations with his wife would cause. The corridors of the judiciary were stocked amply with ancient judges, their wigs limp and askew, their gowns and robes tired of long-dead ermine. If one listened carefully, one could almost hear the heavy thud of them dropping in their chambers. Daily he was expecting appointment to the Privy Council. He was just 3 short steps away from the Court of Appeal, a fatal heart attack and a couple of strokes from being Lord Chief Justice. A scandal would put a brutal stop to that. He would be caught in permanent limbo, and see lesser men and women overtake him. Sir Frederick sent the man in the dock before him down for 7 years, to the satisfaction of the prosecution and the police officers in court. It had been a good case. He had heard little of it, but reached a hostile judgment none the less. He could see the guilt in the man's eyes, his barrister's blustering defence, the jurors' faces. Next up was the case of Harold Lentz, robbery with violence. Promising. "I think we have had enough for today," he said. "I propose to pause our proceedings here, and reconvene at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning." He smiled at the jury, nodded in gratitude to them, and adjourned the session for the day. It was 4 p.m. "All rise," said the clerk. The judge gathered his papers and walked with slow dignity from the court. Helen had arrived by now, he knew. It gave him a familiar thrill to know he would soon be in her company. They would spend just the evening and night together. She couldn't get away for more than a day. Too busy, she said. He frowned. This was troubling him too, in a minor way. He bit his lower lip and pondered the matter again, resetting his spectacles on his nose as he waited for her in the car at the station. As soon as he met Helen walking across the station concourse, he knew the crisis he feared was coming. There was something disconsolate about her. Outwardly smiling and pleased to see him, there was, in her attentions to her small overnight bag, her perfunctory kiss, her studious application to putting on her seat-belt in the car, and her shaking her hair out in a matter-of-fact way, an undercurrent at work. The judge had a fine instinct for such things, but he said nothing. He smiled, asked after her week in chambers, engaged first gear with a slight, uncharacteristic crunch, and pulled away from the curb. That evening in the judge's lodgings, after dinner at the Silk and Gown, they sat on the sofa and drank a glass of wine in the richly appointed apartment. He spoke of the case earlier, to mark time, and of the case tomorrow, of the man called Harry Lentz, an habitual villain, soon to be incarcerated at his Majesty's pleasure for a considerable stretch, if he knew anything about it. But Helen was distant tonight. He could sense it, and although she listened to him recount the career of Harry Lentz, and to the evidence the judge was already weighing from his reading of the brief, she was elsewhere. At last, with gentle regard, he let the matter of the court drop, to give her the opportunity he sensed she sought. "This can't go on forever," she said at last, running her hands through her hair. She was sitting on the sofa with one leg tucked under the other, half facing him, glass of wine in her slender hand. Ah, there it is, the thought which had been ripening all summer within her, what lay behind her all too brief stay, this visit. She was 38, her clock ticking judiciously, and in mechanical acknowledgment of this, he removed the fob of the gold watch he retained from his waistcoat pocket, and flicked the lid open, slow and meticulous with satisfaction. He peered through his glasses at the crisp, white enamel dial, divided equally by black numerals, round which two elegant blue hands gave a certainty of what the ticking universe was about. "No," he said, "it can't." He waited. He knew the arguments that followed from this proposition, and also knew their course, their fruitless determination. No jury was on hand to bring the matter to a final reckoning. Only arguments would be heard. His guidance was unwanted. "It's been 2 years in a few days. Do you realize that?" she asked. The illicit thrill could no longer sustain her. He nodded, and snapped shut his gold hunter with precision, returning it to his pocket. "Yes," he said. "My goodness," as if she was making a simple observation. She wasn't. He smiled and nodded sagely. "I spoke to Archie Wharton about the recordership at Bradley," he said. "He had a favourable opinion." "No," she said decisively. "No." She knew such trails, and was beyond their temptation. She was not prepared to be diverted from her main purpose by vague promises, or even firm ones this time. She had fortified her resolution to this by degrees of dissatisfaction. "That isn't what I mean." "Well, you'd be the youngest recorder in the country," he persisted, knowing already it was a vain prosecution. "Don't turn it aside lightly." "I don't," she said, "but I meant you and I, us, if there is an us." He looked surprised. "Of course there is an us. Why would you doubt it?" He had a long, shrewd affinity with lost arguments, a tenacity to lost causes from his time as a young barrister. "Is there, though, beyond the odd weekends in lodgings? I mean, is that it? How long can this go on?" Sir Frederick looked thoughtful. He rubbed his chin. "Her legal career is a busy one," he conceded, as if assigning her quarrel to a third party regretfully. "We are servants of our profession, at the mercy of it sometimes, I think." She looked at him steadily. It would not do. Not this time. He knew it as soon as their eyes met, and sighed with resignation. "Is it so bad?" he queried, a gentle appeal to disarm her. "Yes," she said at last. The finality of her verdict hung gloomily between them. "I think," she said, weighing her words carefully, "I've been a fool." "Why do you think that?" he queried softly. "A fool to think that something more could come of a relationship with a married man, with his own life and position in the world." She didn't say much older, a judicious omission, but it was there between them none the less, and she was undeniably right. Freddie saw that. And yet how like a life sentence her leaving him would be, a sentence without appeal or the distant hopeful prospect of parole even. It would be a life of hard labour without respite, until old age and infirmity and finally death would give him honourable release. It was a grim thought, one he had had many times recently, And yet, could he leave Miranda, abandon his life at Deepcut House, his life in the community, the heavy dew on the September lawns, the sun on the roof, catching the campanile on the house as he took Lifer for his morning walk? And what could replace these things? His judge's salary was handsome, but far less than he had earned as a successful barrister. It had not mattered that he had earned less when he became a judge, because his wife was wealthy. Now it would matter. And worse than this, Miranda was a mean woman, vindictive. She'd ruin him, not just financially, but socially, and she'd destroy his reputation. She had those kind of contacts. Her brothers, high and mighty men in the world, would take it badly, and they had real pull in the corridors of power. He'd never be Lord Chief Justice. If he had been wealthy himself, he might chance it, weather the storm of possibilities to make the great leap, to abandon his marriage and Miranda and all it entailed for one last fling of the dice with Helen. But he wasn't. He stood to lose everything that was dear to him. "I have reason to think I will come into some money soon," he told Helen suddenly. "Why do you think that?" There was scepticism in her voice. "It's complicated, but, well, I'm confident that a windfall is coming." "Will that change things?" He was under examination by an expert lawyer. "Yes, oh yes," he said. He wasn't on oath, but he knew this was a lie. "It will make it possible to leave Miranda. We can get a place together." "We can do that now," Helen objected quietly, watching him closely. She knew his deceits. He shook his head. "No, not with my outgoings and commitments. It will need a sizable chunk of money for that." She shook her head. He was lying, and in any case she'd heard promises before and was used to Freddie's delaying tactics. She considered the distant prospect of something better as being his speciality. The matter ended unhappily, or at least an unspoken resolution was within her, he knew. They retired soon afterwards, slept together, made dispassionate love. In the morning there was a feeling that with the fading gold of the September sun, the affair was ripening to an end. It would not survive this session. Helen returned to chambers in London in the morning. He saw her off at the station, a sombre farewell, and he returned to the lodgings for a gloomy, solitary breakfast. He felt the crisis of his life was at hand. Later that morning he sat at the bench, still considering the matter, as he heard the case of the Crown against Harold Lentz. He looked at Lentz with distaste. He was a thief, 37 years old, an habitual offender, one who had served 3 prison stretches for robbery. There were always umpteen other offences to be taken into consideration on such occasions prior to sentencing. He was a man with furtive, darting eyes, like a cunning animal now caged. The present case was different than his usual form. Lentz was accused of robbing a jewellery store, during the course of which he had beaten the diminutive shop owner severely when he had resisted him. Or so it was alleged. It was doubtless true, though. Sir Frederick had no doubt in his mind that Lentz was guilty as charged, and the evidence pointed to him convincingly. He denied the charges, claimed an alibi which turned out to be his thin, unattractive wife, and was obviously false. It was slightly comical. Lentz had hurt himself in the struggle, and helpfully deposited a sample of his blood at the scene, which police had delighted in collecting. The prosecuting barrister gleefully waved the paper with the lab results confirming the blood was that of the defendant in court. "I have here the results of the laboratory tests which examined the blood samples collected by forensic officers at the scene. Exhibit F," he said. A forensic chemist was examined on these. They proved beyond any doubt that the samples belonged to the accused, Harold Lentz. Sir Frederick glanced at the jury. He was used to reading the faces of jurors, to interpreting their doubts, their looks of scepticism, their puzzlement, and sometimes their profound boredom. In this case, their faces spelled bad news for Mr. Lentz. They didn't believe a word of his testimony. This time, Armstrong knew Harold Lentz was going to be found guilty of robbery with violence. With past offences taken into consideration, he was facing a lengthy incarceration at His Majesty's pleasure. He must sum up the case against Lentz this afternoon, and then consider the matter of sentence. It would be a grim day for Lentz, and yet Sir Freddy felt his own position in some ways inferior to that of the defendant. His own sentence had been settled on the train back to London that morning. He sensed it. It engendered in him a gloominess of mood and a certain recklessness as he sat at his desk during the interval and composed his closing comments on the Harry Lentz case. Then he thought of Helen again, of Miranda, and the familiar reverie now took a new turn. He saw the figure of Lentz in his mind, a career as a jewel thief now coming to its terminal point, and he came to a sudden decision. Yes, thought Sir Frederick Armstrong, I've found the right man for the job. Lentz was the man he was looking for. The will to act, the time and circumstances had all come together at this moment for a purpose. A smile came over his face, and he nodded quietly to himself. Yes, Lentz is the man. He read the words he had written on the paper before him, a summary of the evidence against Lentz, then tore the sheet from the pad on which he had commenced this, and screwed it into a ball and tossed it into the waste paper basket. He hovered above the clean page now revealed to him, seeking inspiration, and then bore down on it with his neat gold pen. Later that afternoon, Judge Sir Frederick Armstrong sat at the bench. He polished his glasses carefully and habitually checked his pocket-watch, routine movements which always preceded his final remarks to the jury. It settled his nerves for the task ahead, the charge to the jury. The police sat in court, satisfied with their case. Armstrong was not known as a soft judge. He had little sympathy for improbable defence arguments. Reasonable doubt was a high hurdle with him, and he always made it clear to a jury his opinion on what he called lightweight testimony. It was a pleasure to police officers and prosecuting counsel to hear him say of a defence witness, "Do you believe this man? Do you accept the word of a man such as this? And when you weigh this against the evidence presented by appointed officers of the law, is it not an insult to your intelligence as intelligent men and women to suppose he could be telling the truth?" Judge Frederick Armstrong was a darling to the police and prosecutor, but today was to be a most unwelcome surprise to them. Judge Armstrong looked severe enough, but it was at once apparent there was equivocation in his mind. He spoke routinely at the need for the jury to be certain in their minds that the prisoner and no one else was guilty of robbing the jeweller's store, and that the defendant had beaten the owner in the course of the robbery. And then, "You have heard from the prosecution that Mr. Lentz was himself injured during the robbery, and that his blood was discovered at the scene, which, according to forensic evidence, was unquestionably that of the defendant, that is, Mr. Lentz. You have heard also that some of the items removed during the theft were discovered in a cavity wall recess in Mr. Lentz's garage. The jeweller, Mr. Bronstein, has picked out Harold Lentz in a line-up as the man who robbed and assaulted him. It is on this basis that the prosecution argues that Harold Lentz and Harold Lentz alone was responsible for the robbery and violence which occurred on the 3rd of April last." Here the judge looked over his glasses at the jury to see their reaction to his summation. Satisfied, he shuffled his papers before him and cleared his throat before continuing. "The defence case, ably represented by Mr. Bryant, has argued to the contrary, that Mr. Lentz entered the jeweller's 3 days prior to the robbery with the object of purchasing a brooch for his wife's birthday, which was, as a matter of record, the 2nd of April, the day before the robbery. Now that is a very significant matter, it may seem to you, because, according to Mr. Lentz, he had cut his hand on some jagged pipework outside of the shop, and upon entering Mr. Bronstein's establishment, he noticed his hand was bleeding profusely. In fact, say the defence, Mr. Lentz did not purchase a brooch on that visit precisely because the condition of his hand was causing him some distress. Now, the significance of this is very clear. The blood sample retrieved 3 days afterwards by forensic experts has been accepted by the defence as belonging to Mr. Lentz, but they argue that it was a blood sample collected in error and did not relate to any injury which the robber and assailant may or may not have incurred on the occasion of the robbery on the 3rd of April. The Crown does not accept this and maintains that no such injury occurred 3 days before, and that the defendant was simply, if you will pardon the expression, casing the joint in his visit on that occasion. That is, familiarizing himself with the premises in order to perpetrate a robbery. Well, what are we to make of this conflict of evidence? We have seen the injury to Mr. Lentz's hand, and the sister of Mr. Lentz testifies that she bandaged it at her house on the 1st of April, where he arrived with his hand bleeding profusely. Now, Mrs. Weed, the defendant's sister, strikes one as an honest witness who gave her testimony in a most straightforward manner. It seems to me that the onus of proof resting on the prosecution, as it must, it is far from clear that the blood collected related to the occasion on which the burglar is said to have injured themselves. "My lord," protested the prosecuting counsel. "What is it, Mr. Lettermore?" The prosecutor had been visibly straining at the leash with the representation the judge gave of the blood evidence, which seemed to him to be wide of the mark. Now his irritation had spilled over. "With the greatest respect, my lord, the witness, Mr. Bronstein, has testified that there was no blood on the occasion at which Mr. Lentz visited prior to the robbery, and CCTV footage examined appears to confirm this. Also, that he had the premises cleaned on the 2nd of April, and Mrs. English, the cleaning lady, has testified that she cleaned the premises thoroughly, and that there was, in any case, no blood present." "Mr. Lettermore," the judge broke in, "I do not propose to argue the case a second time. These arguments have been gone into quite thoroughly between yourself and Mr. Bryant for the defendant. In my summation, I am simply endeavouring to present and interpret these for the benefit of the jury. Now please resume your seat and refrain from further interruption. We have a great deal to get through, and I do not propose to have my thoughts interrupted in this way." The judge looked exasperated, and studied his papers to find his place before addressing the jury once more. "The ladies and gentlemen in the jury may disregard the untimely interruption by counsel for the prosecution," he said. "I want simply to make it clear for your benefit that notwithstanding the limitations of CCTV, and we have seen some very unconvincing footage of the Crown case in this, there is a difference of opinion and a great deal of uncertainty as to the source of the blood evidence which has been attributed to Harry Lentz. It may be that you will satisfy yourself that the evidence in respect of the blood may go either way. That is entirely a matter for you." Turning now to the evidence of Mr. Bronstein, who identifies the defendant as being his assailant and the man who entered his store and assaulted him on the 3rd of April, we can have nothing but sympathy for this gentleman, and express our relief that his injuries have not proved to have had long-term effects on his health and physical well-being. Now, the defence has argued, most persuasively in my opinion, that Mr. Bronstein, who we are told was present in the Bull and Whistle at lunchtime, had been drinking alcohol and was suffering from the effects of this. The Crown has said Mr. Bronstein drank a single half-pint of lager, and that this was the only beverage he consumed. that until that time he had not taken a drink in some 14 months, owing to a medical condition. Well, it may be a matter for your most earnest consideration that Mr. Bronstein claims to have been in the pub for over an hour, and quite possibly a great deal longer, and yet managed to refrain from indulging himself beyond a single half-pint of lager. That, it seems to me, is a most extraordinary thing. It may seem to you that far from aiding the prosecution case, the claim that Mr. Bronstein had not consumed alcoholic beverages for 14 months until that very day was a most peculiar circumstance. His constitution, being unused to the effects of alcohol, may have produced peculiarly adverse effects on him. The defence has argued, and I am inclined to agree with them, that it is a possibility that Mr. Bronstein, in his confused state, may have lost his balance and fallen down, sustaining his injuries in the course of this mishap. The prosecutor, Mr. Lettermore, sat with barely concealed fury as he listened to the judge. The police looked plainly apoplectic. Even Mr. Bryant, for the defence, looked greatly surprised. The defendant, Harold Lentz, looked like a cornered fox, convinced some trick was in play. Turning to the matter of the jewels concealed in the cavity in Harold Lentz's garage, continued the judge, now this may seem to be a damning circumstance at first glance. The prosecution has said these are the stolen jewels, missing from Mr. Bronstein's shop. What has Mr. Lentz to say about this? He says that his garage is unlocked most of the time, and that the jewels could have been planted there at any time and by anyone, possibly some rival with a malicious intent. Apart from the extreme imprudence of Mr. Lentz's failing to secure his garage against possible intruders, I am inclined to think that Mr. Lentz, a man with many associates of a criminal disposition, was regarded as maintaining a safe place for others to house stolen goods. I do not know. We have no proof of it. I will only remark that I remain unconvinced by the case presented by the prosecution in this regard. But it is for you, members of the jury, to weigh these matters carefully, and to ensure that, whatever doubt there may be in the matter, the benefit of it is given to the defendant. Mr. Lentz is undoubtedly a man of low moral character. He may not be someone whose friendship we would wish to enjoy ourselves. He may be a cheat and an habitual liar. Yet it is all the more important with such a man that we are not tempted to extend such judgment from his moral character to infer a criminal one. The jury retired, and upon their return they found the defendant, Harold Lentz, to be not guilty. A low rumble of incredulous discord went about the court, a shuffling of people and seats. The police in court, at first bewildered, were now convinced the judge was having a thoroughly bad day. They had sat red-faced and frustrated as they listened to the judge openly inviting the jury to doubt their evidence. "He's going senile," opined an irate detective inspector who had devoted a great deal of time and effort to the construction of the case. The prosecuting barrister sighed heavily in sympathy and shook his head. "Utterly unfathomable," he concurred. The Red Lion was quiet at lunchtime. It was 3 days after the acquittal of Harold Lentz that a man with thick-rimmed glasses, a coat-collar raised, and a flat cap pulled well down over his eyes, entered the pub and looked around cautiously, appraising carefully the clientele. Satisfied, he entered. Inside it was gloomy. A blonde barmaid looked up at the man from her mobile phone, which she was swiping idly with her thumb. She noted his flat cap conspicuously pulled forward, half shielding his eyes, as he scanned the room before settling upon a man at a fruit machine. He walked towards this man after a moment's hesitation. "Mr. Lentz?" said the stranger. Harold Lentz looked round darkly, a fugitive look of apprehension. He peered at the man who had addressed him, struggling to place him beyond a faint recognition. Then suddenly it came with startled disbelief. "Is it?" he said with astonishment. Justice Sir Frederick Armstrong nodded. "Yes," he said quickly, forestalling further words. "What?" said Lentz, struggling for articulation. "What do you want?" "A quiet word," said Frederick Armstrong smoothly. Harold looked uncertain, cautious. "What about?" he said at last. He was greatly puzzled. "Let me get you a drink first," said the august Justice of the High Court. Harold stood his ground, still wrought with suspicion. He looked around quickly. Then he said, "All right." They sat at a table in a dark corner, distant from anyone else, from the risk of intrusion or the mischance of being overheard. "I bet you're not happy," said Harold, recovering his composure as the judge, still capped and caped, returned with 2 pints to the table. "Now why do you think that?" asked Sir Frederick quietly. "Because you made a pig's ear of my trial. I have to say, thank you very much. The coppers aren't too happy with you, I reckon." He chuckled. Armstrong considered this and waved it aside. "Never mind about that," he said. "I want you to do me a favor." "Me? Why?" "Because I did you one," he said simply. "By messing up the prosecution case?" "Yes, if you like," said Sir Frederick, eyeing him steadily. "You were looking at 10 years, you know, at least. Robbery with violence, with form, too." The smile left Lentz's face. He was thinking hard. "Go on," he said. "I have a job for you." "A job for me?" "Yes, I want you to steal something for me." "Is this a set-up?" asked the wary Lentz, looking about carefully. "No." "Are you wearing a wire?" Sir Frederick laughed softly. "Listen, I got you off for a reason. I want you to do a job for me. I'll pay you very well for it." Lentz looked furtive, but his avaricious nature was in command. "How much?" he queried, taking a sip of his pint. £50,000, said Sir Frederick. Lentz was silent for a moment. "That's a lot of money," he said at last. "What do you want me to steal?" "A diamond." Lentz looked at the judge. He knew diamonds, he knew jewels, and he understood the market for them, the difficulties attending their sale and resale when they were not strictly above board. "It must be worth a lot," he said cautiously. Sir Frederick smiled. "You don't need to concern yourself with that," he said. "I do. I'm going to steal it," parried the thief. Sir Frederick studied him judiciously, then exhaled steadily. "It's a diamond worth £5 million, he said. "It was," he paused to find the right word, "given to my wife's great-great-grandfather in India for services." The thief whistled. "Services, eh?" he queried slyly. "Yes, services which should probably have seen him imprisoned for a very long time," quipped Sir Frederick. A grin spread over Harold Lentz's face. "He was of my stamp, then," he laughed. "In a manner of speaking, yes." Harold's eyes were glistening as he considered the matter. At last he shook his head. "You can never sell that," he said. "No one will touch a diamond like that, and good luck finding someone who'd be willing to recut it too. Might as well be a pebble for what it's worth on the resale market." "I don't want to sell it," said Sir Freddy, waving this objection aside. "I want the insurance money." "Ah," said Lentz appreciatively. He was not in this kind of business. "I'll collect the insurance on the diamond." £5 million of insurance. That's a lot of money," said Lentz. "I'll give you £50,000, no more." "It'll be an easy job," Freddy assured him. "The easiest job you've ever done." "How so?" queried Lentz. "I'll be away from the house for the night. Putting one of your chums behind bars in Brampton with any luck?" He grinned humorously at the irony of this. "I will leave a window to the rear off the latch, and the alarm will be disarmed. All you have to do is climb over the rear wall into the garden and make your way to the window. It will be damaged to look as if it has been jemmied. Once you're in, you will go through the door into the hallway, up the stairs to the landing, and left into the dressing room next to my wife's bedroom. The safe is in there, and you'll find it unlocked. I will have damaged it to make it appear to have been forced by the intruder. Open it and take a package from the safe. Leave by the same means." "That's all?" "That's all," confirmed Freddie. Lentz was thinking it through carefully. "Your wife's at home?" "Yes." "What if she wakes?" he asked. "She won't. She takes sleeping pills at 10 p.m. She doesn't wake before the early hours. I'll make sure she has an extra one that night. She'll be out cold." Lentz nodded appreciatively. "Now here comes the important bit," Freddie continued. "As you leave, you must make a noise to disturb the neighbors." "Like what?" "I don't know. What would be normal? What normally gets you caught?" Lentz gave a short laugh. "It all sounds too simple," he said. "It is simple. An easy job. The easiest job you will ever do in your life." The two men spent 2 hours discussing the easy job, the location of the house, the layout and geographical features of the area, and the house itself. Finally, Harold Lentz agreed. "You have to tell no one, I mean no one, about this arrangement. You understand?" urged Sir Frederick. Harold Lentz did. "That includes your wife," insisted Freddie. "I wouldn't dare mention it to her," said Lentz. "She'd have a fit so soon after my recent acquittal." "Quite," said Sir Freddie. "And one more thing. We will never meet again." "How do I get my money?" inquired Lentz. "It'll be in the package in the safe for you. £50,000. That's how you'll get your payment." "And the diamond?" "It will already have gone," smiled Sir Frederick significantly. "I wouldn't want to tempt you and have it go missing, nor for you to get caught with it." Lentz sat thinking it through for a long time, visualizing the job through from start to finish. "How high is the wall at the rear?" he inquired at last. "About 6 feet. There's a mound of compost against the wall on the garden side. It'll be easy to climb back over if you can get in via the wall." "That won't be a problem," said Lentz, eyes gleaming. "Any dogs?" "No. Our Labrador will be in Surrey." Lentz nodded. The two men went through the house layout several times, Freddie giving precise details of each room and its peculiarities with great care. Lentz thought for a few minutes more. Frederick Armstrong watched him closely. "All right, I'll do it. There's just one thing." "What is that?" "I want 250,000 to do it." 250,000! exclaimed the Honourable Sir Frederick. "You're kidding me." "No, it's 5 million to you, and you need my professional services," Lentz insisted. Armstrong said, "Yes, but—" "I know," interceded Harold Lentz, smiling. "It's robbery." "It is." Sir Frederick Armstrong looked at the man shrewdly. He was weighing it up. "It's a deal," he said, thinking hard. They didn't meet again, though Frederick spoke to Lentz by phone, as they had agreed, in which he gave him a simple instruction, consisting of the date and time on which the easy job was to be done. 14th October, he said, 10 p.m. All else as arranged. Lentz listened, committed it to memory, and then said simply, 14th October, 10 p.m. as arranged. Okay, and replaced the receiver. On the 14th of October, Lentz was restive all day. It was always like this before a job, but today there was something different. This was the biggest thing he'd ever been involved in. It was an easy job, to be sure, and yet nothing is a certainty, and there is always something unforeseen, something unexpected intrudes upon the best laid plans. Perhaps he was anxious because this job was so easy, so foolproof, or perhaps it was because the crime was commissioned by a High Court judge. Harold Lentz spent the day upon such thoughts until the cold October sun went down and the night grew dark. He had dressed in dark clothes, a thin black beanie hat was on his head, and light black leather gloves were stretched onto his hands as he prepared for the night's work. He wore a luminous dialed watch and placed a small cylindrical torch in his pocket. Harold Lentz left his house at 9:30 p.m. and took the tube to Chelsea. Here he alighted, about a mile from the judge's house in his estimation, and walked to Cadogan Square, listening to the softness of his practised footsteps as he went. He thought of the £250,000, and it brought a gleam of excitement to his eyes. A long trip abroad was indicated. Costa. He had friends there. The great white houses of Cadogan Square were as he had seen them in daylight, when he had paced out this route in careful rehearsal 3 days before. He looked at his watch. Almost 10 p.m. He went quickly round to the end of the road and arrived at the rear of the house, and came to the high wall there, reached up to the top with his hands, and scrambled up skilfully, saddling the top and over, dropping silently to the soft compost mound beneath. He paused and listened. Nothing. The lights in the house were off, and he ran softly across the grass lawn to the window. It was open, its catch broken. He slid the sash window open, and it moved easily, noiselessly, as the judge had promised it would. He climbed in quickly, and saw a censer flash in the upper right corner of the room. A red light. He waited. Nothing. He nodded with satisfaction. The judge was as good as his word. The security was disabled too. Harold Lentz moved across the room tentatively and silently, with all the stealth of his craft. He had never had such an easy job in his life. His eyes shone in the dark at the ease with which he accomplished his entry. And the irony that this was a judge's house too, and the judge was his confederate. The world is a funny place, he thought, as he flashed his torch about the place. Judges, coppers, priests, they're all as bad as each other. At least I'm an honest burglar. He entered the hallway to the ringing silence of a deserted house. He stood in the hallway, the light from the street out front shining through the window above the long door. A column of dust upon the tiled floor fixed to a pattern of the window there. He could hear only his own heart and the faint sounds of traffic beyond. The house was still. He crossed the hallway and to the foot of the stairs, where he paused before ascending these silently. On the upper landing he halted. He breathed evenly to settle his nerves. There was something unsettling here. He paused again to listen. Nothing. What was it then? Something was wrong. His burglar's instinct was jangling a furious warning. He shone his torch and easily picked out the door of the dressing-room on his immediate left. Still there is a warning within. He cannot fathom it. Is it that he is burgling a judge's house? No, surely not. There is something else, but he doesn't know what it is. His gloved hand, careful upon the dressing-room door handle, turns it slowly. The door opens, and he tenses to its faint creak upon its hinges as it swings in evenly on its axis. Again that sense of something being wrong assails him. He raises his torch to take brief possession of the room in its beam. He picks out the safe and moves over towards it. He turns the handle of the safe smoothly, and it makes a noise, a slight noise which sounds thunderous in his ears. He listens. Nothing. Silently the door of the safe is opened, and then he stops. There is alarm within, though he doesn't know why, and then it comes over him, a revelation too late. He stands and strides quickly to the door of Lady Armstrong's bedroom, which leads directly from her dressing-room, and opens it. He isn't concerned for the noise now. Something is wrong. He is afraid. In the flashlight he sees the bed and a woman lying there very still, staring at him in horrible ghastly rictus, mocking him in a kind of terrible warning. There is a knife shining with blood on the glistening floor. He lets out a cry of horror, is frozen to the spot, his legs like jelly now, trembling with fright. And then a sound is heard behind him, and he turns his head suddenly upon it, knowing what it is. Behind him stands the judge, in wig and gown, a shotgun in his hands, and the faintest smile upon his face. The judge, Sir Frederick Armstrong, who stands there an executioner, has a look of strange, excited madness in him. There is a flash from the nozzle, and an explosion. Harry Lentz feels a painless thump in his chest, stands there as if to defy the moment. The flashlight falls to the floor. It is the last sound he hears, and then he falls in silence to the floor. The judge turns on the light. He walks to the late Harold Lentz, then places the knife in the man's hand, presses his fingers into it and spatters him with blood. He trips the alarm, which now shrieks fearful to the night, and then walks to the phone. "Hello, police," he says in a voice shaking with terror. "Oh, God, yes, please. Yes, this is an emergency. My wife has been murdered by an intruder. I've shot the man. I don't know whether he's alive or dead. Please hurry." He replaces the receiver and removes his wig. He looks at the dead man on the floor and then at his wife, the late Lady Miranda Armstrong. "An easy job," he says.